The most successful scientists can tell a great story.
Science is messy and complicated and hard and human.
Trying to bring some empathy into these scientific discussions.
There are all sorts of psychological effects of narrative.
There's a story going on there. In fact, there's usually a whole set of stories.
I think storytelling is hugely underrated but massively important part of science.
How are we going to tell a story with this data?
Hang on, this wasn't the scientific fairy tale I was told.
Hello, and welcome back to the Storyology podcast, where I, material scientist and storyteller Dr. Anna Pajewski, take a deep dive into the intersection between science and story. Last time we heard from Alex Freeman and Marcus Manafo, who told us about some of their worries when it comes to how science is communicated. We heard about how incentive structures in academia put researchers under immense pressure to publish, and in some cases, they're being encouraged to spin retrospective narratives that stray pretty far from the truth of what really happened. We also heard some sage warnings about how scientists need to be aware of audiences' narrative expectations of them, and the conflict that scientists face between communicating all of the messiness of real research and telling a good story. I want to know in this podcast whether science can take the benefits of storytelling, such as how it can help us to communicate complicated things in a nice linear narrative, while not allowing ourselves to be led astray into untruthful territory. That is the question that this podcast seeks to answer. What follows now is an investigation into the presence of story down the pipeline of how science gets done to find out the extent of story's influence. And we're going to start at the beginning, which is where the money comes from. Scientific research costs a lot of money. The Office for National Statistics puts the UK's expenditure on research and development at £70.7 billion. That's £70.7 billion pounds in 2022. That's about a quarter of the £283 billion pounds that the country spent on healthcare in the same year. And much of the money for scientific research comes from the public purse. With public finances being squeezed ever tighter, it's crucial that this money is spent well and in ways that is going to benefit citizens and society. So, over the next few episodes, I'm aiming to lift the lid on that process and look at all the places where storytelling can be found. Because getting science funded is an exercise in telling persuasive stories to the powers that be that your science should be the one to be paid for. We're going to be taking a look at how scientific funding actually works, what's the process of getting an idea funded, what are the problems with the system as it stands, why should we care about it, and what, if any, are the solutions. And of course, throughout all of this, we're going to be tracking how storytelling comes into it. Along the way, we'll hear evidence from 6 experts who know all about the process of getting science funded. I started by speaking to someone right at the top of the chain.
So my name is Andrew Clark. I'm Executive Director of Programs at the Royal Academy of Engineering, which means I look after a whole bunch of things that we do to support the development of talented engineers. In practice, the main part of that looking after is talking various funders, including government, out of the money to do interesting things with. But I then also get to supervise the teams that do all sorts of things to give out grants with that.
And I also spoke to someone who makes the decisions of who gets funded and who doesn't.
Yeah, so I'm Louise Kenny, and my day job is that I'm the Executive Pro-Vice Chancellor of the Faculty of Health and Life Sciences at the University of Liverpool. And by background, I'm actually a clinician scientist, so I'm a doctor, but I also have a PhD, and I'm really interested in something called the developmental origins of health and disease. So that's my scientific background. But I think in terms of this conversation, I also serve as chair of Population and Systems Medicine Board at the MRC, and I review grants for a range of funding bodies internationally.
Of course, I also talk to researchers themselves who are all vying for this cash to get their scientific ideas funded.
Yeah, sure. My name is Ravi Desai, and I am a scientific and translational writer at the University of Oxford.
So I'm Dr. Alex Baker. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Warwick, and I focus on neglected tropical diseases, diagnostics and therapeutics.
Hi. Do I have to say hi? Hello, my name is Dr. Jess Wade, and I'm a Royal Society University Research Fellow and Lecturer at Imperial College London in the Department of Materials.
Jess is also known for activism in science equality, writing and editing hundreds of Wikipedia articles for minoritised scientists, and you'll hear Jess refer to that work in our conversation. In this first episode, we're going to find out how science funding works from the top down and where story comes into it. First, we're going to hear from Andrew Clark, the Director of Programmes of the Royal Academy of Engineering, to give us the lowdown of who pays for scientific research in the UK. I started by asking Andrew, who are the similar funders to the Royal Academy of Engineering, and how do they all fit together into the broader funding landscape?
So the main ones are the other national academies, the Royal Society, the British Academy, the Academy of Medical Sciences. They're sort of in parallel with us. There's UK Research Innovation. It's much larger, the primary recipient of government funding. You've also got the new Advanced Research and Invention Agency. It's sort of in parallel with us. But there's also quite a selection of public sector research establishments of all sorts of kinds. And they similarly would have this kind of very long-term trusted relationship with government where they're receiving regular funding, but in return for that need to give very close reporting of what's going on and make sure they're always telling a compelling story that that money is well used, highly impactful, and that there's going to be a benefit back to the government and citizens' priorities.
Okay, so here's our first mention of story. People and organisations who receive government money for scientific research have to tell a compelling story back to their funders about how much impact the research that they've funded has had and how it will ultimately benefit us, the citizens. The major benefit of storytelling that I can see to do this would be to exploit the fact that storytelling is often all about communicating some sort of change. Sometimes it's a change in the world that the story takes place in. Sometimes it's a change in the character. John York says in his book, Into the Woods, that storytelling is the dramatisation of the process of knowledge assimilation. And in a research story like this, it's the researchers themselves who have assimilated knowledge and effectively added it to the scientific record. So when it comes to communicating the impact of research, funding bodies will be wanting to evidence what the world and characters were like before they spent the money, and then show that there's been a measurable change to the world and the characters today. But of course, the funding landscape is massively complicated, as we've just heard, with lots of different organisations all vying for the same dosh. Part of Andrew's role is to liaise with government and with all of those other organisations to work out who the money is going to go to. And, he told me, story is an integral part of that.
There's a story going on there. In fact, there's usually a whole set of stories, because normally when there's a discussion on funding for a period of science for a research and innovation organization, we're asked to look at a whole bunch of scenarios. And these usually vary from something that's about the same as what you've got at the moment, as you're asked to tell the story about how you'd evolve and what you've done in the past and how you can use the recent past as a reasonable guide to what might be the outcomes of the future. You'll probably also be asked to consider scenarios where your funding will drop considerably. And then you've got to say, well, what would be preserved? What would be lost? And then there's usually a more optimistic, what would happen if the funding increases on a curve? And then it's a whole question of, well, actually, can you deliver at the rate that this potential funding increase presumes? Will things happen? What does the timeline look like for getting from a funding increase through to actual outcomes and impact that might lead to benefit to society? And each of those stories takes a slightly different quality. And if you're writing a case, you want them to link together, being obliged usually to make a case for an increase of funding, although sometimes also just to say we can manage a decrease in a sensible sort of way, and just occasionally to make a case actually that an increase would not be a good idea at this point, because occasionally you will have, it's usually a politician has a bright idea that we should treble the budget for this tomorrow because they think that would appeal. And it is very rarely the case that you can push out money well quickly on research innovation. You want to go through a process of really focusing where it should go. And if you do have so many good ideas that you haven't gone anywhere near, that you can fund a huge volume of them tomorrow, then you weren't in a good place to start with. So quite often what you're saying is, well, as I say, just occasionally what you're doing is actually wait, hold on, let's go a little slower case than is being suggested by the political or other decision maker. So all those are slightly different sort of stories. You're looking to knit them together to make a case for a particular outcome. You're often doing this in formation with a lot of other people, because the government funding body has many different ways of distributing its money, and it's wanting to see those all be complementary and join up into a whole system. And so we will make contact with the other national academies, with UKRI, with the various PSREs, and all just discuss through how we're seeing our position in the system, how we're telling slightly different but complementary stories. And we know that on some level, we're in competition for the same bit of money. So we don't want to show everything, but we also know that we're also all, if the stories knit together, we're all in a collectively better place than if we all come up saying either wildly different things or that we all want to do exactly the same thing. And so it's kind of a co-created story, set of stories that are joining up into a vision of what might happen, that then a selection of civil service and political decision makers try and knit together into one story, but also crucially a set of numbers. I mean, there is a very arithmetical bit of just the finances and what the spending profiles look like and what the uncertainties look like on them, that one can't ignore that very quantitative part of things as well.
The reason I wanted to start our investigation here is that the first rule of storytelling is to know your audience. If scientific researchers are in the business of persuading funding bodies to fund their research, it would massively help them to understand how funders think, what external pressures they might be under, and what they want and need from these research proposals in the first place. Andrew's description of a co-created story is really interesting in this light. The funding bodies are together writing the story of scientific research on a national and maybe even an international level. So researchers need to write their proposals with that context in mind. Next, I want to turn to the process of getting a STEM idea funded from the perspective of the researchers themselves. So once funding bodies like Andrew's have secured the money from the powers that be, how do scientists go about securing it from them? Jess Wade took me through it from the researcher's perspective.
I guess it depends what stage of your career you're at. You know, if you're relatively early in your career, you can apply for these kind of things called fellowships. So that's something that will support your research for, 4 to 8 years. And it would be a dedicated personal grant for you. And usually there are specific calls that will come out from funding councils or kind of government bodies. And it will be, early career researcher fellowship, whatever. And then you'll spend some time, and you've really got to give yourself time to do this, kind of sitting down and working out what it is that you're proposing to do scientifically. Like, have you done some preliminary experiments that show something that could be really exciting? And then could you build your kind of beginning of your scientific career about it? And the difference, I think, between a fellowship and a kind of normal grant that you might apply for is this is a very personal award for you. So it's really what they're doing right now for your career. It's letting you build a team. It's letting you hire people. It's letting you build your own lab and stuff like that. So what's the narrative there? The story there is really, what do you want your future to be in science? Like, what do you want your focus and your topic to be? Who do you need to bring into your team, or what do you need to build to make that possible? Do you need to hire a chemist? Do you need to hire someone from biology? Do you need some work experience in a business school or whatever? So usually you have to write kind of, I'd say, 4 to 10 pages, depending on where you're applying to. And there's always like stupid prosaic rules about like layout and font size. And everyone always gets very angry with me because I see no need for spaces, because I think probably everyone is reading this on some kind of electronic interface. So if they want to take a pause, they can. And I'm like, let's fill every single space on this page with a word or a diagram. And I actually think like the diagrams part there is so important, like having a schematic that really clearly articulates what you're trying to do. Like on one, this is the scope. This is my next 8 years. This is what we're going to try and do. I always say, every time I read anyone's proposals, I'm like, get some diagrams, like explain it visually. So that's a fellowship. Usually you would write this kind of, say it's your vision or your vision and approach document. And then accompanying that, there'd be a bunch of different things that you have to also write, like a narrative CV. So that's kind of your storytelling of your life and your contributions to science. Or it would be something about the added value that this would bring. There are various different sections that you then have to complete, which are a little bit more wordy. but also super, super important. And then a grant, or you can have kind of targeted calls around a particular area. So there's lots and lots of calls at the moment on scaling AI. So there could be a particular targeted call, and then you'd respond to that, a kind of responsive grant. Or there are just grants that you can apply for, which would unite lots of different scientists to come together for a much bigger project, or you can apply to build a network. So actually, there are lots and lots of different opportunities and mechanisms to get your science funded, whether that's like a little 3-year idea, whether it's a PhD studentship you want, whether it's to build a community. I'd say there's kind of an overwhelming number of options. Knowing how competitive you are in each of those is often really difficult. And as you well know, science is not an intrinsically fair and equal process to apply for. So often you can and actually I've spent probably the best part of the last year putting all of my energy and creative effort into things that were going nowhere from the beginning, because of kind of politics within the academic community. So yeah, it's high risk, high rewards, very limited number of positive return. Your success rate, I should call it, is not very high, which can be really, really demoralizing. Especially when you're going for one of these kind of personal fellowships, because it really feels like they're criticizing you rather than the science. But yeah, it's usually you write a long document and you try and convince a bunch of anonymous people that you're worth their time. And the behind the scenes part of that is super interesting too, because you submit it somewhere, whether that's L'Oreal or EPSRC or whatever. And then there's a kind of initial sift within the funding council. And then it gets sent out for review to external reviewers, who are people who've been chosen by that funding council or awarding body to review your work. And they might give a written response. They might give you a score. So for some of the funding councils, they give you a number out of 6, which is just the most horrible thing. Like your whole career depends on like whether this person's had lunch, or if they're just like, if they've just had a coffee, that could impact how they. Anyway, so the funding council then get back all of these responses. They're supposed to kind of check them for bias and see that they've not said anything horribly sexist or horribly racist. But obviously some things kind of creep through in that. And then after that, they send it to you. Sometimes you'll have an opportunity to respond to that. So you could have like 10 working days in which you construct your response. And then if you're lucky, you'll get to go and be interviewed. And that's another really interesting process, because someone on that interviewing panel will have had to have chosen your proposal, and before you go into that room for the interview, have pitched your proposal to other people, say, hey, we really need to fund Anna. This is what Anna's going to do. And then you go in and you sparkle, and everyone on that panel has to decide they like you. So there's so many chances in this process, or opportunities in this process, where people aren't really evaluating your science. They're evaluating your ability to tell a story. And they're really evaluating your ability to talk kind of about you and about the timeliness of the research and things like that. So yeah, I think we don't value, people outside science don't value how much of it is a personal, it's to do with the scientists and the narrative and the story they tell.
So according to Jess, successful scientists are the ones who can tell a good story. But it's not just that. The successful ones are good at telling a story in which they, as an individual, are the main character, are the hero, if you like. And to lots of scientists, that's quite an uncomfortable story to write. Actually, I reckon for most people, blowing your own trumpet is a bit cringe. But I think particularly for scientists, there's a tension, because in reality, most research is done by huge teams of people, not really so much individuals. And that's a theme that Jess picked up with me too.
I actually find the personal part of it really hard. I'd much rather write about other people than I would write about me. For the last year, I've done 2 really big proposals, one 20 million and one like 2.something million. And that was both for other people. And then I find it really easy, and then I also feel like I'll spend all my time on this because it's going to get this really cool woman professor who I admire so deeply, going to get her some massive thing. So then actually I find it really easy if I'm writing about other people. And I also find it really easy to pull out the parts of their biography that are really key for telling a particular story. As everyone listening to this will know, and certainly, Anna, like when we do these narrative CV sections or these like resume for researchers or whatever, it's supposed to get away from the conventional way of doing a CV or a resume and go towards ones which are like, what are your contributions to knowledge, or what are your broader contributions to innovation and research? And that's really scary for a lot of scientists who've got away with before just uploading some really clunky 31-page CV that no one can really look at. But I think from the Wikipedia stuff, I'm actually really good at pulling that part out of people's biographies. I'm like, oh, that's where you had impact. Oh, that's what you've done for the innovation community. Oh, building that training program is showing your commitment to the development of others. And then, if I close my eyes and wince, then I can sneak in some stuff about what I've done there. But you do get more used to it. I find, gosh, interviews are the most awful thing. You have to kind of go in and be like, I have 10 years expertise in this, or I've been an expert in this for 10 years. And I don't know, I think science encourages us to talk in this really bombastic language, which is really unnatural to people who are just happy behind the scenes doing the research that eventually makes some impact on society. I find the other thing, and probably you find this in lots of the workshops that you run, but the word we is what I rely on in science. We've done this, our team is doing this, we're doing this for X, we showed this. Whereas when you go for one of these fellowship interviews, you have to say I, because if you go in and say we, they'll be like, oh, who are we funding? Like, did you do any of this? And that's really awkward, because as we all know, and as hopefully all the listeners know, science is intrinsically a team effort. And it's, the most successful science is done by the most diverse interdisciplinary teams. So to say I, me with my tiny little experience of the world, it just feels really unnatural. So you have to kind of train yourself to do these things that feel uncomfortable to get through the hoop that you eventually one day want to dismantle.
So what I'm hearing is that centering the individual is one aspect of storytelling that is required for applying for grants. But Alex Baker, another researcher, gave me his take on how he uses storytelling of other characters to make a compelling case.
Yeah, so I think there is, certainly in these grants, there's a lot of you want to sell, but you don't want to oversell. And I do often start a lot of my grants with some kind of key facts, which I think really set the scene nicely. So, World Health Organization statistics about how many people are bitten by snake bites every year and rather than going 2 million people are bitten by snake bites, which is kind of quite a large number that no one really understands. It's a bit like where the government talk about, we put $500 million into the NHS. Sounds like a lot, really it's not. Actually kind of going, well, every 5 minutes, 50 people are bitten by a snake. We're going to have a serious health problem of which one of them will die. It's just much more human, right? In the way in which you put that statistic across. And I think I found that to be a more useful method to really explain these big numbers, because otherwise, people will go, well, okay, well, why are we not just making more diabetes drugs? Because that affects more people statistically. So I think that has to be an argument, trying to bring some empathy into these scientific discussions. So trying to certainly pull out patient stories and things like that, I do think is quite important, and kind of the techniques I try with these grants, whilst trying not to do that classic thing where you become almost, I have certain colleagues who see empathy almost as a weakness and almost will mark you down for that. So trying to walk that line between what is perceived perhaps as scientific, pure rationale and pure logic, whilst also trying to go, well, actually, this is a serious problem and there are people suffering because of this. And, we can't just fund another massive machine that doesn't necessarily have an impact. We do actually need to go and help these people.
For another researcher, Louise Kenny, she found a different way to tap into an interview panel's empathy.
So very early on in my own scientific career, I wrote a grant application to an august funding body. I won't name and shame them. But it was essentially using a relatively new technology to discover biomarkers that would predict pregnancy outcomes. And this is a long time ago when I was just starting out in my scientific career. So it'd be maybe 25, 30 years ago. So it's a cutting edge technology. We were applying it in pregnancy, and I went in and I made this shortcut for interviews. So that's, the shortlist for interviews. So that was really good. And I went into the big funding panel and I gave what I thought was a really compelling pitch. And the first question I got from the panel was, so this only affects women, and only affects pregnant women. So I think that's the definition of a really niche, like, minority disorder, right? And of course, I was very young at the time, and I hadn't thought it through, and I just was completely like a rabbit in the headlights, and consequently did not get the grant on that occasion. It was work that was subsequently funded. And you can say that perhaps it was a really gendered comment, and it was a different time, and it was really, but actually I really blamed myself because, and it was a turning point in my career, because I learned how important it was to pitch your story. And what I learned from that meeting was a 2-line kind of explainer or story or pitch that I have used almost in every grant application and in every interview since. And it goes along the lines of, you might think that this is really niche because it just affects pregnant women, but I would ask you, how did you get on the planet? And it was transformational for my success rate in terms of scoring grants. It's something that, in later years, when I had my own research group and then my own research institute, it became almost like a tagline. You might think that this is niche because it only affects pregnant women, but we would say, how did you get onto the planet? Everyone's the result of a pregnancy, right? And then there was other taglines came along, like pregnancy, the lowest common denominator. It's the one thing that we've all got in common. We might be, men or women or gay or straight or black or white or whatever. But the one thing we've all got in common is that we arrived on planet Earth via a pregnancy. So it became a really useful way of setting the scene and telling the story. So it was a hard lesson, learned the hard way by not getting a grant, in how important it is to set the scene and tell a story. No matter what your audience is, it doesn't matter whether they're Nobel Prize winning professors, as in the case when I didn't get the grant, or people that you're, a group of citizens that you're trying to convince want to take part in your research. You've really got to sell them the story. I didn't know when I was 26 just how critically important it was, but it was something that became very apparent quite early on in my career.
For Louise, then, it wasn't characterising herself as a researcher or even patients as characters in the story, but instead the trick was making it relevant to the audience, in effect, making them the main character. But as Louise found, in some areas of research, that can be quite a tricky task.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a human trait, right? That we're going to invest more time, energy, our hard-earned money, if it's something that fundamentally affects you. And I think that's where, as a women's health researcher, where we've really struggled, because traditionally, historically, women haven't held decision-making positions in funders or in government or in policy-setting organisations, etc. And that's one reason. It's a very important reason. It's a very important contributor to why women's health research has historically been very neglected. But the minute it's someone's wife or someone's daughter, or it becomes very personal. And I noticed that really early on, and I thought, but you can't wait for these decision makers to have a wife and a baby and a daughter. So what's the other way of doing it? And it was that interview on that day that made me think, well, actually, once you remind everybody that you're only here because the pregnancy that you were intimately involved with, you were the passenger in that pregnancy, went well. And there, but for the grace of God and science and whatever, you exist. Once you remind people of that, it becomes everybody's problem. And I think, even we all need to be able to relate to the idea that's being pitched. There has to be a hook, It's almost like learning how to be a salesman, I guess.
That final thought from Louise, learning how to sell, cropped up in my conversation with scientific and grant writer Ravi Desai too. Here's Ravi talking about how to make a persuasive argument in a grant proposal.
So let's see, there is the scientific idea that you are proposing, and that idea has to be achievable but realistic, and ambitious also, and you have to kind of strike that balance. And different funders have different appetites for risk and how much ambition they're willing to balance with achievability. And so that's part of the game. But for a lot of funders, their applications are so competitive that if you get any aspect of the large amount of administration that lies behind an application wrong, that can be marked heavily against you. And so it's a part of my job, a big part of my job as a scientific writer, is to make sure not only the science is up to snuff and attractive to the funder and realistic but ambitious, but also that the admin is, every T is crossed and every I is dotted, if you will. When I think about my leisurely reading everything, which I'm quite scatterbrained when it comes to leisurely reading. Everything from fiction, nonfiction appeals to me at certain times. The stories that are most compelling, not necessarily the stories that are easiest to read, but the most compelling ones are the ones where every word means something. And I think the same is true in a grant application. It's important to make every word mean something. We're oftentimes speaking in the application to two audiences. One is a panel of peer reviewers who are experts in the field and who are going to understand and scrutinize the nitty-gritty science of what we're proposing. But the other audience is they're the funding panel themselves. They're the ones who actually make the decision. And they usually don't have as deep an expert knowledge as the peer reviewers. But so we have to make sure that we calibrate the idea in a way that's appealing to what they're looking for. I think some very fundamental concepts of writing, from how you introduce a topic to, every claim that you make has to be substantiated and it has to be evidenced, and that's appealing for both of these audience members that I was talking about. It's I think those are key elements to being persuasive, and we also have to remember that these panels at the funders, the peer reviewers and the funders themselves are reading lots and lots of applications, and we have to be careful to hit them on the head, if you will, multiple times with the same concept, but pitched in a slightly different way. We can't just write the same sentence over and over and over. And so it certainly helps if there is a narrative story arc to our argument, but it's in a way repetitious.
So to summarize, storytelling crops up in grant proposals in lots of different places. More than anything else, in grants, it's all about character. We've heard about how successful researchers are able to persuasively write themselves as the main character, but also how others have used storytelling to characterize the potential beneficiaries of the research or even the interview panelists themselves. It's also about structure, starting with a hook and telling consistent narrative arcs that repeats over and over again the important information to capture and to keep their attention. And finally, going back to Andrew's point about the funders needing to demonstrate the impact of their spending, it strikes me that their key need from scientists is to be able to communicate really clearly what change will come about if they receive the money. And of course, storytelling is a really useful tool for this because, as I've said, stories are all about change. We started out by hearing from Andrew about the scientific funding landscape in the UK. And I want to finish off by thinking about this idea of a co-created process. Yes, researchers need to tell and sell convincing pictures of their work, down to the very fine details. But zooming out, they also need to show how they'll fit into the wider research landscape, and maybe even demonstrate how their work contributes to big national and international portfolios.
If your thing is a research funder, you actually want to see a whole set of different approaches happen and projects for support, and even projects that are in contradiction with each other, where it cannot be the case that both of them will succeed, right? You want to spread your bets, not have all your eggs in one basket. And considering supporting a portfolio, that is actually the right way to go. And so in building the case for support and the vision for a complex research program, you'll often be talking to a lot of different people who are experts and visionaries, but also very opinionated about how an area should evolve. And often there's a skill one develops through one's career of taking the individual's distinctive visions and knitting those together into something that reflects the sorts of things they're trying to do, but is also somehow abstracted from them and joins them up. Sometimes people complain that's the lowest common denominator sort of thing, that you're actually dumbing down and taking it. And you do see cases that look like that. But I like to think there is a way of doing it where you're saying, look, there is a shared goal of something quite hard and important that's trying to be achieved. So you might say something around the development of quantum technologies at the moment, where there are actually really quite big disagreements on what are the best routes to achieve some of the shared goals. But as a funder, you can sit back and say, I don't know which of these approaches will succeed, but we're going to have an interesting time finding out. Given our resources, we can't do everything we'd like to do. We might focus on a subset of areas or a subset of approaches, and we need to make those choices. But what we're not going to do is just say, here, we're picking one road and pursuing it and backing it in a way that an individual researcher is usually incentivized to pick the thing that they feel particularly empowered to create and make happen. So this sort of looking after a portfolio is a thing you're very used to as a funder. But then it's also a matter of trying to work out just your place in the system. And there's kind of a separate story of trying to work out, given our assets, our distinctive capabilities, and what we see as our strategic vision, what are the things that we want to say we can achieve and really want to see funded?
So that brings us to the end of this Storyology podcast episode. We've learned about the research funding landscape and that telling a story by thinking about characterization, structure, and change is crucial to the success of scientific ideas getting funded. Next time, we'll be looking at the problems with this funding system as it currently stands, and to hear about some of the potential risks that we might run when we use storytelling to communicate science. This podcast is made in partnership with the UK Reproducibility Network, Sonic Screen Lab at the University of the Arts London, and StoryArcs at Bath Spa University. StoryArcs is an Arts and Humanities Research Council funded programme. I've been your host, Anna Pajajski, and if you want to read more about my work around story and science, head over to the Storyology website at storyology.co.uk. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.